Hi, this is a video explanation of the creation of the American Constitution at the Constitutional Convention. So, as we've seen, the first American government, the first constitution that was written for an independent nation, was the Articles of Confederation. And we've seen that those Articles of Confederation were intentionally very weak, with a central government that could not accomplish much. There was a one-house legislature, there was no judicial branch, there was no chief executive, it couldn't directly tax citizens, so it couldn't really get much done. And so in Philadelphia in 1787, a group of delegates met together to discuss changing the Articles of Confederation. But you might remember that amending the Articles of Confederation required an unanimous vote of 13-0. And so what these delegates wound up doing instead was rewrite them completely by eliminating them. So these men who came to be known as the Founding Fathers, they chose George Washington, the former general in the Continental Army, to be the president of this convention, where they kept things very secret. They didn't want anyone outside to know what was going on, and they ended up completely getting rid of the Articles of Confederation, starting from scratch and writing a new constitution for the United States of America. So a couple of debates came up pretty much right away, and one of them had to do with representation of the states in this new constitution. So you might remember from the Articles of Confederation that all states, all 13, were given one vote in their legislature. And that seems very great and equal and everything's fair. However, it doesn't really reflect the populations within each state. So one debate that came up was how many representatives should each state be given? And one suggestion came from Virginia, where this new government would have three branches, that the legislative or lawmaking branch would have two houses, and both of those houses would include representation for each state based on the number of people that lived in that state. So the large states, like Virginia, very much liked this plan because the more people living in a state, the more representation that state would have in the legislature. And that seemingly makes a lot of sense. If you have an awful lot of people living in your state, then perhaps you should have more influence in the government. But the smaller states didn't like that plan because they would kind of be left in the dust. So a different plan, the New Jersey plan, was very similar because it also suggested having three branches in this new government. But they said that the lawmaking or legislative branch should have one house, and that one house would give each state one vote. Therefore, all states would have equal say in what was going on. The smaller states liked that because they would have equal footing as the larger states. So the end result was a compromise of these two. It's oftentimes called the Great Compromise, where elements of the Virginia plan and New Jersey plan were brought together. It would create a two-house legislature, a Senate, which would give each state equal representation. So today, each state has two senators, no matter how many people or how few people live in that state, and a House of Representatives, which would give representation according to the population of the state, which is still true today. So states like California and Texas and even Pennsylvania have far more representatives in the House than states like Wyoming or Hawaii or Rhode Island. So that resolved one issue regarding representation. But within that debate, there's still questions over whether or not slaves should count toward a state's population for representation. So the southern states, as you might predict, believe that slaves should count toward their state's population when trying to determine the number of representatives it would get. However, of course, they also didn't want them to count toward the state's taxes that it would owe to the federal government. But then northern states, on the other hand, they believed that slaves should not count toward a state's population for representation because they weren't citizens. But they did think that they should count toward a state's quota when it came to taxation. So as you can see on this map here, recall that in the 1700s, there were slaves in basically all of the 13 states, but the vast majority of them lived in the South. And so this dilemma over whether or not slaves should count toward a state's population became problematic, and so the delegates at the Constitutional Convention came up with yet another compromise, which is oftentimes known as the Three-Fifths Compromise, which said that 3/5 of a state's slaves would be counted for representation in Congress and toward that state's taxes. So the Three-Fifths Compromise essentially balances these two views: the northern view that slaves should not count for a population, and the southern view that they should count toward a state's population for representation. So two compromises that kind of settle these debates between large states and small states, between northern states and southern states. And so what we end up with is a new constitution to govern the United States, which begins with this very famous preamble, these goals that the new constitution sets out to accomplish. And it's still this constitution with some changes, as we will see, that governs the country still to this day. I hope this helps you understand the Constitutional Convention and the creation of the U.S. Constitution. Thanks for watching.